Exactly. They're planning what would become known as Washington, D.C. Some people have gotten very exact and said that Martha's fan is pointing to the mall. I don't know. I don't know about that. But in the background, you can see Washington's beloved Potomac River, which he thought would really be the gateway to the West. He liked this painting so much, he ordered 4 copies for Mount Vernon, and it was turned into a print that people across America put in their homes. Lots of people had pictures of George Washington, and this was a common one. So Washington's presidency was a great success. He was so successful that it was very hard to walk away. He wanted to end the presidency after 1 term in 1792, but his cabinet was fracturing into different factions, one around the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, another around the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Washington was the only person they all trusted, and they convinced him to stay. But by 1796, he was done. He published his farewell address in a Philadelphia newspaper, and he rode off to Mount Vernon. And it's a great thing that he walked away from power a second time. Washington died in 1799, which would have been the middle of his 3rd term. What message might that have conveyed about the presidency? What would it mean if? Yeah, exactly. That it's lifelong, right? That it's a lifelong position. And instead, I mean, he would have likely died under different circumstances if he wasn't at Mount Vernon. But the fact that he walked away set the precedent for 2 terms, and that really held until the crisis of World War II, and it's now in the Constitution as the 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951. And so Washington died on December 14th, 1799, at age 67, essentially of a throat infection. He suffocated. It didn't help that he was bled by 3 different doctors. But his last words on his deathbed were, "'Tis well." And that's when things just started getting really interesting. That's when the myth-making really took off. And so I'm going to take you on a quick tour of memories of George Washington after his death. There were many very tasteful tributes. Probably the most famous is Light Horse Henry Lee's funeral oration to Congress, in which he said, Washington is first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. But Washington was really celebrated almost like a saint. And like a saint, there was a certain amount of excessive enthusiasm. The marker "Washington slept here" cropped up in places across America. And where Washington had actually slept, Americans didn't want to disturb the bedding or the pillows. There's a lot of cases of newspapers in the 19th century that claimed to have the original, bedding that Washington used. And people even saved chamber pots by the hundreds that he supposedly had used. So this is someone who was really loved. A lot of that love was owed to the way he was treated in his first real biography that was done of him by Mason Locke Weems, known as Parson Weems, The Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington. This is a great painting by the 20th century artist Grant Wood, most famous for American Gothic. And if you notice, the young Washington is not so young. The message there, I think, is similar to Hawthorne's, that, Washington is born as an adult, someone who didn't have a childhood. And this is Weems pulling the curtain. Weems essentially invented the stories of the cherry tree, the stone across the Rappahannock, the idea that there was an American Indian prophecy that Washington would never die from bullets, the story about him kneeling in prayer at Valley Forge, for which there was really no evidence, and on and on and on. He was an itinerant bookseller who got the bright idea that he could make more money by writing the books than by selling them. And after his death, he wrote to a Philadelphia publisher. He said, "Washington, is gone. Millions are gaping to read something about him. I am very nearly primed and cocked for them." And so he really delivered the goods, and this was the most popular biography through the 19th century. The artistic version of this is one example of Washington literally being made into a divine figure, the apotheosis of George Washington. This was originally a painting and a print by the artist John James Barillett, and it was put on everything. In the Mount Vernon Museum, there's a ceramic pitcher that you can see that has it. It even went as far as China, and they traced it on glass and colored it in, and this became a very popular thing. And you see Father Time and an angel lifting Washington to heaven. This became a very popular image. In fact, it's on the ceiling of the rotunda of the United States Capitol. Washington looks pretty small there because it's so far up. This was done by Constantino Brumidi, completed in 1865. And if it reminds you a little bit of the Vatican or the Sistine Chapel, the artist Brumidi actually worked for the Vatican before he came to do this fresco in the Capitol. And so this could become rather ridiculous later in the 19th century. This was an image that came out after Abraham Lincoln died. And you see Washington very affectionately welcoming Lincoln into heaven. I think it's the presidential bromance going on there. This is not as ridiculous, perhaps, as this huge statue, which really turns Washington into Zeus. This was commissioned for the centennial of Washington's birth in 1832, and the idea was that it would go into the rotunda of the Capitol. But when it was completed, the members of Congress thought it was a bit scandalous. Washington's not wearing any clothes. And so they decided to put it outside. They put it outside the Capitol on the east lawn. But after a while, even that was, they thought it was a little bit unseemly to have the undressed Washington right outside the Capitol. Fortunately, and then the Smithsonian was just developing at the time, and they took it on. And today, this is in this museum, Smithsonian National Museum of American History. You can see this. Not everything was outlandish. There were some moving tributes. This is an example of folk art from the early 19th century. And it shows that the Washington legacy and image was something that was accessible to men and women. I love how the woman in this painting is stomping on the crown at the same time that she's putting a laurel, kind of the Republican version of a crown, on Washington. And women were also deeply involved. In fact, they pulled this off, the preservation of Mount Vernon, the most important tribute of all. This is what Washington's home looked like by the mid-19th century when it was discovered by Anne Pamela Cunningham, who went on to found the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, raised all the money necessary to buy the home from the Washington family and to restore it to its former glory. As Cunningham's mother remarked to her, if the men of the United States would not save the home of its greatest citizen, perhaps it should be the responsibility of the women. And one of the most important things they did is during the Civil War, they kept soldiers from destroying Mount Vernon. This was really seen as a neutral zone. This is where Union and Confederate soldiers would both come. They were told to cover their uniforms and to leave their weapons outside the grounds. And then after the war, it became America's top tourist destination, and it welcomes more than 1 million visitors a year to this day. So Washington was a familiar image of the 19th century. He was on the first postage stamp in 1847. This is an 1860s version of that stamp. He shared that distinction with Benjamin Franklin, which of course Franklin had the history of being the Postmaster General in North America. Washington was just Washington. And Washington's birthday was celebrated by everyone in the United States. There was only 2 holidays for most of the 19th century, July 4th and Washington's birthday. And Washington's birthday was made into a formal holiday by Congress in 1880. And this is an image that just shows a family celebrating the birthday. Sadly, Washington's birthday has been captured by the car dealerships, the mattress sellers, the appliance stores, and turned into something called President's Day, which essentially splits the difference between Washington and Lincoln's birthday. But for the record, and you can tell your students this, the federal holiday is still Washington's birthday. I think that this President's Day business speaks a little bit to Washington's current status in American life, which unfortunately is not, as high as it once was, right? Not as involved. The American people's relationship is more detached. I ask young people, what comes to mind when I say George Washington? Can you think of the answer, what they would say? What's the one thing you think about when I say George? I heard a dollar bill. You guys are a good group. This is our current dollar bill. This design goes back to 1963. And I'm not lamenting the fact Washington's on the money. I think that's a great thing. There's a really interesting history of this. 100 years before the current bill was done, the first dollar bill came out in 1863. And Washington was not on it. It was actually the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. And so it took a few years, but eventually Washington made it by 1869. And this is a version of that bill in 1880. And there's been a lot of talk lately about American currency, right? And in its infinite wisdom, the United States government's response to a grassroots effort to take Andrew Jackson off the $20 bill and replace that image with an image of a woman, the U.S. government's response has been, we'll change the $10 bill. We'll take Alexander Hamilton, the founding Secretary of the Treasury, off, and we'll have a woman for a while. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a permanent thing. Fortunately, there's no talk about taking Washington off of the money, right? Well, it turns out that there has been a woman on an American bill before a currency, and in fact, it was Martha Washington. Martha Washington was the first. She was on the $1 silver certificate. It was called that because it could be redeemed for a silver dollar all the way up to 1963. In 1896, Washington and Martha appeared on a silver certificate together on the back as a couple. On the front of the bill, it was called the Educational Series because it was history instructing youth, allegorical figures. And so, Washington is relevant, at least in our pocketbooks, right? The one other way to become relevant today, I think, in American society is through film. And this is one place where Washington's come up a little bit short. There aren't any great Washington movies. In fact, he only has one real Hollywood epic, and that's the 1951 film, When the Redskins Rode. You probably haven't seen it recently. This told the story of Washington on the frontier in the 1750s, except it was revisionist. Instead of being defeated at Fort Necessity, Washington triumphed with the help of Indians that came to his rescue on horseback, no less. And there's been other attempts over the years. You can see the television movie The Crossing, starring Jeff Daniels. Washington was in another television movie in which he was played by Kelsey Grammer, which is on Benedict Arnold. Both of these films tried to bridge the distance that we have to Washington, I think, through language. They made Washington foul-mouthed. There's a point in The Crossing in which Washington tells Henry Knox, move your fat ass, Henry. It just doesn't quite seem like something Washington would say. And then when he's told of that Benedict Arnold had pulled a Benedict Arnold and had committed treason, Washington says, let's hang this son of the bitch. So Washington has had minor roles in other television things. The miniseries John Adams, he's kind of a background figure. The same is true with Turn, which is really about the spy ring that he was in charge of, although he does appear some. He is the star of one show, and you can see that in the lower right. That's an episode of Showtime's series Masters of Horror, entitled The Washingtonians, in which George Washington is a child-eating cannibal. I think last Halloween, the Mount Vernon staff, as a joke, I think, tried to have a screening of this. I don't know. I don't know if everybody was able to watch all of it. That's right. He should be the vampire hunter. So let me conclude and just talk about where this leaves us with Washington today. I talked about the Washington problem at the beginning of the talk. And I think today there's two extremes in the way that Washington is treated. If it's not indifference and absence, I think Washington is treated incredibly critically, particularly by members of the Academy. often in an unfair way, or he's treated almost like a godlike figure, again, the apotheosis idea. And so let me first just describe the critique very briefly. This is a brilliant painting from 1975, a satiric painting by the artist Robert Colescott of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. Transforms Washington into the great black scientist George Washington Carver, and it really takes aim at different racist stereotypes like Aunt Jemima, the blackface minstrel show, banjoist. It also subtly draws attention to Washington's slaveholding. And so I think it's brilliant. I think the problem is in the academy, a lot of academics don't go past this. They don't go past the critique, and so we lose the full Washington. Example of this was on Washington's birthday last year. The New York Times published an editorial titled George Washington Slave Catcher, and it depicted his attempts to recover one of his slaves, Oney Judge, who had run away, which was all true, but it didn't tell the full story. It didn't tell about Washington's change during the American Revolution. So anyways, that's a critique of people that do my line of work. The other extreme is seeing Washington as infallible. And it's that image that makes these images here so funny, really. And you think of Washington as perfect. Nixon crossing the Delaware is the exact opposite. Or the character that Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays in the HBO show Veep, it's just ridiculous because she's so not, Washington. And I think the equivalent of this in the historical field are works by David McCullough, Richard Brookhiser, Ron Chernow, that have collectively been called founders chic. And I admire a lot of these books. I read them. I'd like to write one sometime. The problem is that I think a lot of academics worry that this is all the American public's getting, that they're getting just the view of the nation through the founders, which is just a small snapshot. And so I think what we have to think about this week and what you're doing here, how can you bring back a full story of Washington and the American founding back to your students? How can you overcome the indifference? How can you overcome the cynicism of people today without repeating the exaggerations and the lies of the past? It's a tall task. And I share it with you in teaching about Washington. I think Abigail Adams had the best answer. After Washington's death, she became really frustrated with various efforts to turn Washington into a godlike figure. And she said, "Simple truth is his best, his greatest eulogy." And I think those are great words. I think we have to have faith in the actual Washington story. He didn't have to cut down cherry trees or throw silver dollars across rivers. The actual story is amazing in itself, and we have to bring that to students. His triumphs, his shortcomings, everything. It's a remarkable story. It's the American story, and I think in learning about Washington, you and your students will see that we also discover much about ourselves. Thank you. So we can do a few questions, yeah.
Wants to challenge this?
Stump the historian.
On a little bit bigger thread of something maybe that he touched on.
Yeah.
We might be exploring.
Yeah.
So one of the even comments
Yeah.
here. I feel like in many ways we kind of talk recent times that maybe we don't idealize Washington as much as they did immediately after his death, or even when 100 years after. But to me, I still feel like we do. And I'm wondering, what if?
Yeah.
Is it because he's the first, and we've obviously lasted years after that constitutional convention? So is it because he's the first, or if anybody who was the first, as long as we didn't fall apart immediately,
Yeah.
we had an Articles of Confederation that didn't work very long.
Yeah.
And then we're like, oh, but the Constitution's great. So I just kind of wonder.
Yeah, I think it's a great question to think about why Washington is celebrated as much as he is, and I think you hit upon it, right? It's the first plus amazing success. I mean, if you think about Washington's legacy, we're his legacy, right? The United States of America, Washington D.C., Mount Vernon, in my case, George Washington University. We can point to all of these different things that have turned out pretty good, and you know, all of these different things in some way or another started from here. So we think about Mount Vernon, it's from here that protests against, you know, various British acts in the 1760s and 1770s were planned. It's from here that Washington left to become the commander of the Continental, you know, Army. It's from here that he left to become the chair of the Constitutional Convention and then president. Most things that started from here or started from Washington turned out pretty good. So I think that's a big part of it. Another thing I think is this celebration of the military in the 18th century, and the fact, you know, he always went by the name, responded to general, even after the American Revolution. And I joke with the political scientists at GW, you know, that shows what a good politician he was. That he kept that. He was known by something else, but that was what he was most famous for, was, you know, creating the country and leading the armies to victory. So I think all of these things, and I think that's a good question for all of you to carry with you this week. You know, what is Washington's significance, and what might it be for our time? Right? We might celebrate different things than people did in the 1700s or the 1800s.
I think it's also difficult because some of the misapplied versions of this story were successful.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Lincoln, Fertilizer's book, Founder's Son, spent so much time showing that Lincoln didn't know Washington or Jefferson at all, but it still worked for him.
Yeah.
And other people like him.
Yeah.
And even the wrong story is still positive in its way.
Yeah. And I think that's a hard challenge for all of us. I think it's a hard challenge for Mount Vernon, and that is that the myth worked pretty well through the 19th century, right? The sort of inaccurate story, had a successful track record. And so how do we replace that with what actually took place, and can that be as powerful? And so I think what I'm suggesting here is that it can be. I think the story of Washington giving up power, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive the way that we think today about achievements. We always think about people doing something, like, you know, actually accomplishing something, not an absence of something, not a negative, not walking away. But that's what made him so great in his time. That's what people appreciated about him. But in order to convey that, we have to bring our students and the American public back to the 18th century in that setting, so they understand how important that was. So I think you're absolutely right that all of these figures had these myths that were very attractive, but myths, right? Yeah, last question. Yeah. Yeah.
I've been wondering if Washington's deficiency of education was an issue with some of the people that some of the other, you know, as a teacher and teaching about him, I see this as an inspirational thing. Just
Yeah.
was this, you know, that being the sort of second son and not getting that first son,
Yeah.
and making something of himself. To us as Americans 200 years later, that's a very inspirational thing. But was that the attitude of his peers?
Yeah.
Once he had been raised up in society?
Yeah. No, actually. So there's a lot of gossiping that went on, right? There's a lot of talk. And Jefferson in particular was pretty hard on Washington's lack of formal learning, his intelligence. But it's a funny critique. He says that Washington was not a Newton, he wasn't a Bacon, he wasn't a Locke. Well, who was, right? I mean, who, if that's who you're comparing him to? And I think that Washington also had the challenge of running around with a really accomplished, smart group of people, right? But I think you're absolutely right. The key to his education is that it continues, just not in a formal way. And so this is the inspirational side, I think. If we go back to Pope's Creek, if we go back to Ferry Farm, all the signs pointed to Washington becoming a moderately successful, mid-level tobacco planter, right? There's nothing wrong with that life in the 1700s. It was a good life, but it isn't what he accomplished. And I think the difference is a combination of his ambition, his judgment, and his will, that he continues to learn, he continues to read, so that he could run in those circles, even if he wasn't quite the equal of Jefferson or Franklin in book smarts. He outdistanced them in these other ways, right? His bearing, his character, all of those things. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
You think it got him more trouble with his relationships or perceived relationships with kids and the lead rather than politicians or the ideal?
Yeah, that's good. That's a very informed question. So, yeah, I mean, he has the equivalent of that among other officers in the Continental Army. That he, part of being a military person in the 18th century was doing a lot of reading. There's a whole field known as the military arts, and the fact that he had only this experience from the 7 Years' War really does open him up to a lot of criticism. Absolutely. And so they're always kind of questioning his moves. Ultimately, things turned out well for him in the end. So he overcame various critiques. Yeah. So I think that's it. Well, thank you guys so much. Those are great questions. And we're going to have a fun week.
And would you mind if we put your PowerPoint on the Dropbox?
Let's do it.
All right.
Yeah.
So Lucy will help grab that from you. All right. Thank you so much. And Denver, did you remind them about their video watching and group breakdown?
So this week we have all kinds of exciting things happening. You all know the groups that you're in for the Constitution?
I have the sheet here if you need it.
You're
Okay.
We're going to talk about that right now. So you all will be in a different group for the Constitution. You'll be either in a large state Virginia group. That's Washington's group.
And that's Heather, Jessica, Susan, Amy, and Jan.
Or you will be in the small state, the New Jersey group.
That's Monica, Jennifer, Gibbs, Paul. Oh, Paul's not here. Jenna and Michelle.
Okay. And then the founder of the moment, Alexander Hamilton, the man with his own musical. That's the other group, the Hamilton Clan.
James, Teresa, Kyla, Ryan, and Robin.
And then the last group are the rabble-rousers, the anti-federalists, the ones that thought that this was all junk.
Up for it, Melanie, Jennifer Spiegel, Denise, Christy, Elizabeth, and Laura. Rabble-rousers.
Yeah. And so this is for Thursday. We'll be looking at the Constitution. You'll be watching a video of a lecture that I did a couple of weeks ago on the critical period. This is the period before the Constitution in the 1780s, when there's a lot of concern about the future of the United States. So you'll be watching that, and then we'll talk about the video. We'll talk about the Constitution on Thursday. And what I want you to do in your groups is you've got an individualized document. So I want the Virginia large state group. You have the large state plan. And so I want you just to read it and to know. We're not going to have you stand up and give speech like James Madison, but we want you to be able to represent some of the ideas from that. And the same is true for the New Jersey Parliament. And Nancy Federer was get a speech by Patrick Henry. It's pretty fiery. So we might need to read it. So that's all for
So in the Dropbox, when you see those separate readings, you only have to do one of those four for Thursday. So that's why. Yeah, Laura.
So this video is downloaded on our.
Yeah, and there's also a YouTube link if you. Oh, okay. Yes, it's downloaded. Great.
There's some questions for you guys to consider while watching the video. Is that right?
Well, in their PowerPoint, yes.
It's in the top.
Yes. Great. Thank you very much, Denver. So you guys have gotten to know a little bit about George. Next, we're going to be